Everyone before them had failed. Some had even died in the attempt. On a lonely stretch of windswept beach, two bicycle makers from Ohio gambled their lives on a strange new flying machine. For the Wright brothers, success or disaster hung on the next 2 minutes. On the morning of December the 17th, 1903, flight lay just outside their grasp. In the late 19th century, flight was still for the birds. Would-be flyers dreamed of floating like a bird, not a fish. That same dream took root in a middle-class neighborhood in the Midwestern town of Dayton, Ohio, in the unlikely home of the Reverend Milton Wright. In 1889, Wright's wife, Susan, died of tuberculosis. 2 years later, one of his sons still hadn't got over her death, as Milton recalled. His mother being a declining rather than a suffering invalid, he devoted himself to taking all care of her, serving her with faithfulness and tenderness. Such devotion of a son has rarely been equaled. A hockey accident during his senior year had required an operation on Wilbur's mouth. The operation led to complications to his heart. It took him 3 years to recover. He gave up a place at Yale, studying theology, to tend his sick mother. The whole experience left him introspective and thoughtful. To outsiders, he simply seemed cold. His lively younger brother, Orville, tried one prank after another to lure Wilbur from his sickbed. On a summer's day in 1892, he eventually found one that worked. The bicycle craze had just hit Dayton. Bicycles had once been large, clumsy, dangerous contraptions with a huge front wheel. Not anymore. This was a new type of cycle, with both front and rear wheels the same size, and dubbed the safety bicycle, because the rider was closer to the ground. It was widely hailed as one of the great inventions of the century, fast, reliable, and liberating. Orville's enthusiasm for the new contraption was driven by his wish to share it with his brother. Unlike Wilbur, Orville was a prankster, constantly seeking attention. But their differences in character only sharpened their fondness for each other. There was nothing that saddened Orville more than to see his older brother sunk in depression, and nothing that gave him greater pleasure than to provide him with new purpose. To the quiet, withdrawn Wilbur, his first ride on a bike was like nothing he'd ever known. He felt free, and for the first time wondered what it might be like to fly. The brothers were so captivated by their new hobby that they pooled their money and opened a bicycle shop. At first, they simply sold and repaired bikes. Then they began to modify them. Within 3 years, they had developed their own bicycle, the Wright Special. Still in their 20s, the Wright brothers were running their own prosperous business. They had achieved the American dream. But it wasn't enough. Wilbur was searching for something more. He realized he was wasting his talent on a machine already perfected by somebody else. ever restless, he searched for a bigger puzzle to solve. If there be a domineering tyrant thought, it is the conception that the problem of flight may be solved by man. Once this idea has invaded the brain, it possesses it exclusively. It is then a haunting thought, impossible to cast off. In 1899, he wrote to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., requesting anything on the subject of flight. I am about to begin a systematic study of the subject in preparation for practical work, to which I expect to devote what time I can spare from my regular business. I am an enthusiast, but not a crank, in the sense that I have some pet theories as to the proper construction of a flying machine. Yours truly, Wilbur Wright. In the previous century, the real advances in human flight had come in lighter-than-air vehicles. Balloons filled with hot air or hydrogen gas were able to cover hundreds of miles. Heavier-than-air flight, however, was still a flight of fancy. A breakthrough of sorts came with the English inventor John Stringfellow. Using steam power, he designed a self-propelled model flying machine that actually rose under its own power for a couple of feet. A full-scale attempt was made by Hiram Maxim, the American inventor of the machine gun. In 1893, he built a 4-ton craft he felt certain would fly, thanks to its 2 powerful steam engines and 18-foot propellers. It lumbered down an 1,800-foot track on cast-iron wheels, struggled 2 feet into the air, and crashed back to Earth. The best results were made in Germany by Otto Lilienthal, flying simple gliders. He performed spectacular glides to cheering crowds. But his greatest feat was publishing a set of tables that assessed the aerodynamics of various wing surfaces. His book became a Bible for all would-be aviators. He urged them to learn to glide first, to get on intimate terms with the air, before taking the risky step of adding a motor. It was while piloting one of his own gliders that Lilienthal crashed and died. Still working in the bicycle shop by day, Wilbur read all the books and pamphlets recommended by the Smithsonian. Otto Lilienthal's work eventually dominated the cluttered desk of Wilbur Wright. But Wilbur was struck by how little concern even Lilienthal had given to the matter of control in the air, as opposed to merely keeping stable. Wilbur instinctively sensed that a more sophisticated technique was needed to control all 3 axes, forward and backward, side to side, and roll. Of the 3, roll was the toughest. While studying birds, Wilbur noticed how they banked in a turning, not as Lilienthal thought by shifting their center of gravity, but by adjusting the tips of their wings. How could he copy that movement without using impossibly heavy gearing mechanisms? Alone in his workshop one evening, distractedly twisting and untwisting a bicycle in a tube box, he noticed how the twist forced one end up. If it worked with a stiff cardboard box, why not with a wing? 3 days' travel from Dayton, Ohio, were the beaches of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. For the brothers, Kitty Hawk provided the perfect test site. The long, open beach was 1 mile wide and 60 miles long. The winds blew constantly, and here they could try and fail in private. The nearest house was a life-saving station 5 miles down the coast. Each autumn, for the next 4 years, the Wright brothers returned to Kitty Hawk. That first year, Wilbur had only one thing in mind: to put his theory of wing warping to the test on a homemade kite. Wilbur's enthusiasm was infectious, and it wasn't long before Orville became fully involved. From that moment on, the two brothers were equal partners in the quest for flight. Wing warping clearly worked, but it was hard to manipulate the wings and the rudder at the same time, especially in strong winds. Worse, the wings weren't producing the lift Wilbur expected from Lilienthal's tables. Sometimes, the kite simply wouldn't stay up. But Wilbur was encouraged by their progress that season. We considered it quite a point to be able to return without having our pet theories completely knocked in the head by the hard logic of experience, and our own brains dashed out in the bargain. Returning to the bicycle shop in Dayton, they immediately set to work, designing and constructing an entirely different machine, the largest glider the world had ever seen. It was 22 feet from wingtip to wingtip, with an aggressive curvature of the wing to support the weight of the craft and pilot. In July 1901, the Wrights would return to the Outer Banks of North Carolina with high hopes for their new creation. For the locals of Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers were a constant source of speculation, with their expensive equipment and fine clothes. They were a minister's boys, unmarried, who never swore, drank, or smoked. Yet they were attempting to fly, something many in those parts believed unnatural, even blasphemous. For the brothers, 1901 was not a good year. Their new glider was a bitter disappointment. When we looked at the time and money which we had expended and considered the progress made and distance yet to go, we considered our experiments a failure. At this time, I made the prediction that man would sometime fly, but that it would not be within our lifetime. That season, the Wrights broke camp early. They talked of giving up entirely the quest for powered flight. The following August, Wilbur received a surprise invitation to address the prestigious Western Society of Engineers in Chicago on the subject of flight. He spoke of the Wrights' work to date, illustrating his talk with slides of the 1901 craft's most successful glides. He was overwhelmed by the response. But another inventor was challenging them for the honor of being the first man to fly. Professor Samuel Langley, a world-renowned astrophysicist and head of the Smithsonian Institution, was building a flying machine of his own. Assisted by a team of 4 workmen, funded to the tune of $50,000, he was well advanced in the design and manufacture of a gas-powered, heavier-than-air machine. The race for who would be first to fly was on. Back in Dayton, the brothers decided to establish once and for all whether Lilienthal's lift tables were correct. In a wind tunnel they themselves designed, they tested 6-inch metal wings of different shapes. Out of the wind tunnel experiments came the stunning discovery that Lilienthal's figures were wrong. This led to other breakthroughs, some of the most spectacular in aviation history. And the 1902 glider was the result. It measured 32 feet from tip to tip, 10 feet more than the 1901 machine. The wings were narrower and less curved, to produce less drag and more lift. Still more lift was provided by the new horizontal front rudder, trim and rounded, unlike the bulky rectangular front rudder of 1901. Greater control was achieved by adding a vertical tail of 2 6-foot fins. All in all, it was the first glider in history to be fully controlled in 3 axes of motion. In 5 weeks, the Wrights achieved almost 1,000 successful glides. At one point, they glided 250 times in just 2 days. All they needed now was an engine. Powered flight was almost within their reach. Returning to Dayton, the 2 brothers built their own 12-horsepower internal combustion engine from scratch. Once again, they showed an astonishing ability to put their self-taught minds to any mechanical problem and triumph. The design of the propellers proved more daunting. What at first seemed a simple problem became more complex the longer we studied it. With the machine moving forward, the air flying backward, the propellers turning sideways, and nothing standing still. But by late September 1903, they were ready. They left Dayton with $1 from their father, Milton, to telegraph news of success or failure. Either way, they assured him they'd be back by Christmas. Immediately, they began building their flyer. Professor Langley, meanwhile, announced the testing of his great aerodrome. It weighed about the same as the Wrights' flyer, but had a motor 4 times as powerful, and was to be launched from a houseboat on the Potomac River. Reporters were kept waiting for 3 months, while Langley made final refinements. On December the 8th, 1903, with much pomp and fanfare, it was launched. It dropped like a stone. Langley died 3 years later, a broken man. The Wrights were now America's only hope for powered flight. But things looked hopeless. Problems with the propellers made Orville return all the way to Dayton for new shafts. And now a gale was lashing the Outer Banks. Both doubted they could test the flyer before Christmas. Then the rain cleared. The wind was still blowing a dangerous 27 miles an hour, but the Wrights decided to risk it. They hung out a flag to summon witnesses from the life-saving station nearby. One of them, John Daniels, noticed Wilbur and Orville stood close together. After a while, they shook hands, and we couldn't help notice how they held on to each other, like they hated to let go, like 2 folks parting who weren't sure they'd ever see each other again. Orville won the toss. His older brother's hopes rested on him. At 10:35 exactly, Orville released the holding line, and the flyer slipped down the track. The machine quickly picked up speed. "45 feet down the track, the flyer lifted into the air. For the first time in history, a heavier-than-air powered craft had taken off from level ground, moved forward under its own power, and landed at a point as high as it had begun. It was man's first flight. With the dollar their father had given them, Wilbur cabled the news. Success. Started from level with engine power alone. Average speed through air, 31 miles. Inform press. Home Christmas. Wilbur and Orville. The press took little notice. Some believed Langley's failure had proved flight impossible. And by the time newspapers noticed the Wrights, the brothers had changed their minds about sharing their flying secrets. The commercial value of their discovery had dawned on them. Over the next few years, they perfected their invention on an airfield near Dayton, postponing exhibitions until they could mass market their flying machine. Not until 1907 did Wilbur's demonstrations in France bring home to a stupefied public the significance of what they had achieved. He became a celebrity overnight. His moth-eaten old hat even set the trend for Paris fashion. In America, one display was watched by President Theodore Roosevelt, who promptly offered himself as a passenger, the first head of state ever to fly. Most spectacular of all, in front of an estimated audience of 1 million people, Wilbur Wright, the bicycle mechanic from Dayton, flew 20 miles from the Statue of Liberty up the Hudson to Grant's tomb and back. Others were now catching up, inspired by seeing Wilbur at Le Mans. The Frenchman Louis Blériot crossed the English Channel in 1909. As for the Wrights, by 1912 they were wealthy men and making plans to move the family into a large property near their old home. But the battle to defend their patent had been a bitter one, particularly for Wilbur. And in May, after an attack of food poisoning, he died. He was hailed as a national hero. His brother Orville died in 1948, in the jet age, when for millions flying had become matter of fact. On that beach in Kitty Hawk, an old world died, and the new took wing.